So hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another discussion video in my ongoing read-along of Anthony Powell's series, A Dance to the Music of Time. In the month of September, we read the 7th book in the series, which is The Valley of Bones, and the first book, which takes place in World War II. This video is going to be fairly spoilery, so do not watch it unless you are doing the read-along and have read this book. But today I'm going to do what I usually do a quick introduction to the plot of this book, then talk about some things I really enjoyed, a few particular characters I want to discuss, and then a few particular interesting themes in this book. So to quickly run through what happens in this book, it starts somewhat into World War II, and Nick is joining a new company as an officer. In the first chapter, he arrives at the company, meets the people he'll be working with, specifically Roland Gwotkin, who is his direct superior, and also Kedwood, who is, I think, roughly his equal, maybe a tiny bit above him. The next day, another officer turns up, someone called Bithell, who the other officers decide to play a prank on and put sort of a figure in his bed, which he then does a weird dance around anyway. The first sort of half of the book deals mostly with kind of Nick's life in the military. The company is moved to Northern Ireland, and we find out that one of the other officers, Sergeant Pendry, has quite a lot of problems at home. It has been suggested that his wife is having an affair, and by the end of chapter 2 he has died, assumedly by his own hand. We also look at Captain Gwotkin's kind of struggles to always follow commands. He's very, very enthusiastic, very keen, he works really hard, but he doesn't always get things completely right. Later on in the book, Nick travels down to London for a training course, and on the way he meets a man called Penniston, who he actually met a long time ago. He was the man with the orchid at Mrs. Adrianus's party in book 2, which was a very long time ago. While on the course he meets a man called Odo Stevens, and he also meets someone he knew a very long time ago, Jimmy Brent, who once had an affair with Jean Templar, who Nick also once had an affair with, so they have a discussion about that, and Nick doesn't obviously reveal that he once had an affair with Jean, but Jimmy Brent is quite keen to talk about it. While there, Nick has a weekend's leave and he goes to stay with his sister-in-law, Frederica Budd. Nick's wife Isabel is also staying at Frederica's, so Nick gets to see his wife, who he hasn't seen for a long time and who is very pregnant. And there are a lot of other people there, several people who we've met in the past, including Dickie Umfreville, who is suddenly engaged to Frederica, and also a sister of Charles Strigham, who seems to be going out in some way with Robert Tolland. We see Priscilla again, who seems to take a slight fancy to Odo Stevens, and just many, many characters turning up again. In the 4th chapter of this book, Nick is back with the company. They've been stationed elsewhere. Nick notices some changes in Captain Gwotkin, and eventually realises that these are the result of the fact that he has fallen in love with a girl in town called Maureen. He is married, but he is deeply, deeply fallen in love with this girl, which is causing a lot of problems. Various other things takes place. Bithell is arrested because he may or may not have kissed another man in the army, and by the end of the book, Gwotkin is replaced. He is removed from the regiment because he is considered to not have been doing that well, because he has been forgetting code words, not passing on orders, and in general kind of not doing as great a job as he could have done because he has been distracted by Maureen. He is replaced by Kedwood, who has been promoted, and pretty much within 24 hours of having been stripped of his post and replaced by Kedwood, he also sees his kind of girlfriend Maureen sleeping with Corporal Gwilt, one of the other officers, and also finds out that his father-in-law has died. Pretty bad 24 hours for Gwotkin. And Nick also finds out the same day that he is due to move on and he is being stationed somewhere else, and he takes a train to the place he is supposed to be stationed, where he encounters Widmerpool, who is now very senior and in the army and has decided to employ Nick because he knows him before. So that's basically what happens in this book. Quite a lot, I suppose. There are a lot of things that I love about this book. I think one of the main things I love about this and the next couple of books in the series is the way they look at World War II and what it was like to be an officer in the Second World War. The boredom and the misery of it, and the lack of sort of everyday comforts, and the disassociation from society, and kind of the way the world changed with World War II, and how that was suddenly, you know, the army became the driving force of so many people's lives. Another thing I love about this is kind of looking at the character of Gwotkin and his kind of decline and fall over the course of the book, but I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute when I sort of spend a bit more time talking about him as a character. Another thing I really like in this is the building of Nick's character. Nick is a fairly absent character from some books, despite being the narrator. In the first few books, I think you get quite a lot of his personality, and then in the next few books, kind of as his personal story sort of fades into the background, it becomes more about various different characters, I think you do see a little bit less of his personality, and he becomes sort of quite private. We don't see that much of sort of him and Isabel and their marriage and engagement and so on. However, although this book is in many ways kind of focused on Gwotkin, we also do get to see quite a lot more of Nick in terms of his, like, everyday wants and needs. We see a bit more of his kind of emotional reaction to things. He says that while stationed at Castle Malloch, he knew despair. He talks about missing Isabel, and there's that moment where they see each other again after a long time, and she says it's been a long time, and he says a bloody long time. Like, although it's a really small moment, you get the sense of how much they miss each other and how much they struggle being apart from each other, and sort of what a good couple they are together. And you also get a sense of his like everyday needs, a desire for sleep and chocolate and tea. There are a few kind of brilliant moments which really focus on the kind of physical deprivations of war, like when Watkin gives Nick some chocolate because he knows that Nick missed dinner and that it was partly his fault and he feels really bad, and Nick is just like so completely grateful. And a moment earlier on in that chapter where Corporal Gwilt manages to source them some tea, and Nick is just like near to tears at the prospect of tea because he's so like thirsty and hungry and miserable. Like, those kind of small moments which show how miserable it was being in the military, aside from kind of fear and the bigger things, just the small things like food and sleep, is just really, really interesting. I also love in this book the kind of mix of humour and darker themes, as you get in quite a lot of this series. There's that really kind of powerful scene where the divisional commander comes to kind of inspect things and is like having a really long rant about porridge and asking the men if they would have liked porridge because there wasn't any porridge, assuming that they're going to say yes, they would have liked porridge because he is upset with the officers for not providing porridge, when they're all like, no, we don't like porridge, because they think that's the right answer. And it's really, really silly and funny. And then a moment later we find out that Germany has invaded Norway and Denmark, and the tone is suddenly much darker. And I feel like there are a lot of moments throughout this book which kind of blend the light and the dark in a really, really powerful way. So there are a few particular characters I want to dwell on a little bit in this book. The first I want to talk about is Roland Watkin, who is in many ways a kind of focus in this book. And he's a very, very interesting character. He has this sort of great seriousness and earnestness towards the army. He is really, really keen to kind of get ahead and takes his position very, very seriously. At the same time, he doesn't always get things right, he does make mistakes, he's not necessarily that suited to it, and he also does lose his temper. But at the same time as being someone who loses his temper, he is also someone who feels that he should apologise and who feels bad for losing his temper. Like, I do think the moment when he gives Nick that chocolate as a kind of apology for losing his temper with Nick is just really, really powerful in terms of showing the kind of man he is. And you do get to see quite a lot of his kind of character arc throughout the book, the way he changes after meeting this girl, Maureen, who he falls in love with. You know, in the first half of the book, he is kind of very sceptical about the fact that all the men keep on talking about girls, and, you know, he says something a bit ridiculous like, well, as a married man, I'm so glad I don't have to think about women anymore. I'm like, well, maybe you should think about your wife sometimes. But I don't think he does think about his wife very much, which is one of the reasons why he is so able to fall in love with this girl, Maureen, which completely changes his perspective on things. He's still really invigorated about the army, partly because it is that which has brought him to know this woman, but at the same time he is constantly distracted. He forgets to pass on code words, he isn't as organised as he should be, and it's this which kind of leads him to be removed from the company and to be replaced by Kedward. Another thing I think is quite interesting to talk about is his kind of lack of cultural references and the kind of way in which him and Nick don't share the same sort of cultural references and the same kind of worldview. I think it's quite interesting to look at the fact that in the first 6 books of the series, a lot of the characters Nick interacts with are from a very similar class background to himself. You know, most of the men have been to university. And then he gets into the army and, like, he's the only man of all the officers who's been to university. A lot of the men are younger than him, and a lot of the men have very different backgrounds. And Watkin sort of has this one copy of Kipling, which he likes one story in because it's kind of connected with the military. But otherwise he never gets any of Nick's cultural references, and often Nick will, like, say something and Watkin will look at him like, are you a bit mad? Because he's just not someone who's interested in books at all, and he has a kind of completely different cultural framework, which I think is really, really interesting. It's very different if we think of when Nick meets this man Peniston on the train, and they have like all of these cultural references in common and start just like talking about random French philosophy because they have all the same kind of cultural reference points in common. Whereas when Nick talks to Watkin, often like Watkin misses what he's saying, and often he doesn't kind of completely understand Watkin because they have these very, very different backgrounds. Another character I want to quickly mention is Kedward. I think Kedward's quite an interesting character, especially in the last chapter when you see how much he changes with change of command. When he becomes much more senior to Nick, suddenly their footing completely changes, and he is quite harsh and inobservant. He doesn't really understand why Watkin has taken it so hard, but because to him he is practical. Watkin didn't do a good job. Of course he should be removed from his position. Kedward thinks he will do a better job, and he goes quite quickly from being Nick's sort of friend and ally to being his senior commander who is determined to have sort of basic quality standards and to ensure that the company is run as he believes it should be. Another character I want to quickly mention is Odo Stevens. It was interesting because I wouldn't have remembered his name, and then the moment his name was mentioned I was like, oh, Odo Stevens, I remember him, as happens every now and then reading this series. Odo Stevens is quite an interesting character. Nick talks about the way he is both sort of very narcissistic and thinks very highly of himself, but also is very observant and interested in those around them. He comes across in points as being not that nice a man. He is a bit rude about other people sometimes, and I don't especially warm to him. But also, he offers Nick a lift, even though it's slightly out of his way, because he is kind and he sees no reason not to, and he does seem to like Nick. I do think that's quite interesting. And I also think he's quite an interesting character in terms of making Nick feel old in some ways, because Odo Stevens is very young, has a very different worldview and life experience and expectation. That wonderful moment where Odo picks Nick up on the way back from their leave, back to their course. Nick's been spending the weekend with his family and sort of spending time with his wife who's about to have a baby, and then he goes and sees Odo Stevens, and Odo's like, had a great weekend, has sex with a local girl under a hedge. You know, it really draws attention to the very, very different life stages of Nick and a lot of the officers he's working with, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. I also want to quickly talk about Bithell, because he's quite an interesting character as well. There's something about Bithell that reminds me of Widmerpool. And I don't know if it's just that the audiobook narrators' voices for them are a little bit similar, but I think it's also that Bithell is what people who knew Widmerpool at school might imagine Widmerpool would grow up to be. But Widmerpool has actually, as we see at the end of the book, grown up to be someone very, very effective, someone with a lot of control and a lot of power, and someone who seems to be very good at wielding power and who seems to be very, very intelligent. Whereas at school, Widmerpool was quite bullied and seen as a kind of figure of fun, and that is kind of how Bithell is considered in the army. He's someone who seems to constantly make a bit of a fool of himself and to not be considered to be very great. And he also kind of effectively somehow spreads these rumours / suggests slightly on the phone that he may be related to a VC and may have once played rugby for Wales, which he did not at all. But he seems to have like suggested this in order to kind of get a better position as an officer potentially. And he kind of goes on to Nick about how he wishes he had been a varsity man himself and seems a bit of a buffoon in some ways. Bithel's also quite interesting to look at in terms of his sexuality. I think it's quite heavily suggested that Bithell is gay in terms of the way he talks about his servant in the army, Daniels, and certainly suggests that Nick at least thinks that Bithell kind of fancies Daniels, and obviously there is that moment at the end where he is arrested for kissing another soldier, although it's not clear whether or not he actually did, or whether he just kind of hugged him / fell upon him. And that is quite interesting in itself in terms of looking at army discipline and army treatment of homosexuality in World War II. So now I want to talk about a few of the themes in this book. Mostly I think about the way this book deals with war. I think it's very interesting in terms of the way it looks at kind of boredom of war. Like a lot of this book is about being bored, kind of waiting for action, doing training, going through courses, having to go through various exercises but not really being sure what you are contributing, and the kind of pressure of power as well. There's a moment where sort of they're waiting for orders and the rest of Nick's men are lying down, and he just like really wishes he could just lie down on the floor and not have like the responsibilities of being an officer. Connected to that I think is the kind of misery of war, and I spoke already a little bit about like kind of physical deprivation, the fact that within the army like the three things that are prized above everything else is like sleep, food and tea. Like these are the things that bring people comfort because they don't have much else. You know, that moment where Gwotkin gives Nick chocolate and it feels like the best thing that's happened to him for months. And when he's on leave and kind of travelling towards the course, he feels like he's been let out of prison. Like that's what it feels for him. The army kind of feels like prison. He talks as well about the kind of impossibility of writing during wartime. And as well there is that moment with one of the privates who kind of just absolutely breaks down and says he can't, you know, he can't do it anymore. His back aches. He's so sort of physically and mentally exhausted, you know, which shows the kind of mental strains of war. And as well we have the suicide of Sergeant Pendry, which is partly to do with his troubles at home and his difficulties to patch things up with his wife who seems to be having an affair, but also I think brings home the kind of mental strain of war as well. Another thing this book deals with quite interestingly is the kind of coarseness of army life. And I spoke already about how Nick is kind of out of his social comfort zone in this book. He mixes in social circles he never has done before. But you know, like there's a lot of dirty humour in this book which you would never find before. Like a lot of the officers have a really dirty senses of humour. There's a lot of dirty jokes, there's a lot of like toilet humour and jokes about sex in a way that you don't get in the previous books, because that is just kind of what army life is like, which Nick and perhaps some of the other officers too find a bit confusing. In civilian life, Nick kind of mixes with kind of like artistic circles. You know, he's a writer, he has friends who are musicians, but he also kind of moves in more like city circles, I suppose, like Peter Templar and other stockbrokers. But when he gets to the army, most of the people he are mixing with are A, younger than him, and also they're kind of like middle tier, middle class bankers with completely different sort of fields of cultural references to him. I spoke already about kind of the lack of understanding and reading of books amongst the rest of the people that Nick associates with in the army, but also you get this kind of different sense of humour, different discussions, they're just kind of very different conversations within the army life in comparison to kind of the conversations and the people Nick spent time with in civilian life. Another thing I think is interesting in this book is how it kind of continues the theme of music. Obviously music is pretty important in this series, it being called A Dance, the Music of Time, but I think the way this book uses music is really, really interesting. And I think it's especially been like brought home to me by the audiobook, because whenever there are sort of passages of song, the audiobook narrator does sing them, and that kind of reminded me just how much music there is in this book and just how many sort of passages of song there are, because it's something that a lot of the soldiers use to lift their spirits. And then there's also the moment of Robert Toland's death, when Anthony Powell compares life to a game of musical chairs where the music stops and some people are left without a seat. Like, I just think that's a really like harrowing way to describe death, to compare it to musical chairs. It's like such an incongruous image that it's really like really powerful in some ways. I just think that's a really, really powerful image there, and again kind of ties into the theme of music. A few other things I wanted to mention in this book. One, I think, is the theme of like Britishness and Welsh versus Englishness. And one thing that sets Nick apart from the rest of his company is that he is a writer and a lot of the rest of them are bankers, but also another thing that sets him apart is that he is English and the majority of them are Welsh. It's the first time I think I clocked how English as opposed to British the first 6 books in the series are, but in this it feels much more British. You know, the company are mostly Welsh and they spend a lot of time in Northern Ireland, and there is a kind of juxtaposition between Welshness and Englishness and Irishness, which I think is just really, really interesting here. And you know, that's something as well I think which I probably noticed more on this reread because I'm listening to the audiobooks and the audiobook narrator does Welsh accents, and the kind of differences between like the Welsh accents of so many of Nick's fellow officers and his own English accent is just quite interesting. Another thing I think is quite interesting is the kind of juxtaposition between middle age and youth. Like, Nick is in his 30s, as is Bithell, and I think Gorkin must be, he's a bit older, but the rest of the officers are mostly really young. Odo Stevens is really young, and Nick suddenly feels old and is much more aware of his age. I've already mentioned that moment at the end of, I think, the 3rd chapter where Nick's been, you know, spending the weekend with his pregnant wife and Odo Stevens is telling him about having sex with someone under a hedge, and it just really very much emphasises the very different stages of life at which those two characters are at. And I think as well it's quite interesting to see how the army really makes Nick feel his age, or even just older than he is. You know, he's only like 35, he's really not very old. But because like in the army physical fitness is so important, he suddenly feels like much more comparatively older than he would be considered in peacetime, which I think is really interesting. So I think that's everything I wanted to say on The Valley of Bones. It's quite a lot today. I think this may be a slightly longer video than usual, so I am sorry for that. But I hope you're all still continuing to enjoy A Dance to the Music of Time. In the month of October, we are due to read The Soldier's Ark, which is the 8th book in the series. Not gonna lie, because October is Victober, I'm probably not going to read this in October. I'm probably going to read it in the first few days of November, but I will try and have a video up on it within the first week of November so I don't get too far behind, and I am really looking forward to reading it when I get to it. So thank you very much for watching. That is all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.